This MSI Titan GT77 was sent to us by Intel to showcase their new Core i9-12900HX processor. It so happens a few days ago we will have posted a review of an Asus ROG Strix-Scar 17 SE, which has the Core i9-12950 HX processor, which is very similar. The difference comes down to memory support. That laptop can support ECC memory, this cannot. Apart from that, it comes down to how the manufacturers have used the processor in the laptop. So, why are we showing you this very slightly lesser laptop? Well, it's an engineering sample. And would you believe it's got 4 M.2 SSDs, each 1 terabyte, they're all Gen 4, and 4 sticks of DDR5 memory, 64 gigs in total. It's absolutely bonkers. With the Titan GT77, MSI has a lot to shout about, and on their product page for this laptop, they do exactly that. It packs a mighty CPU-GPU combination, albeit you can spec different CPUs and GPUs, and the total power supported by this chassis is absolutely huge. The cooling system inside the laptop is also huge. It has to be, and it's also the reason why it has such a big booty at the back. That's all cooling system. The input-output ports on either side of the laptop are extensive. It slightly annoys me that one of the points on the same web page is that they shout about the slimness or thinness of the chassis. 23mm thin. Just look at it. By eye you can tell it's not. This is a big laptop. That dimension there, if you ignore the rubber feet, is 23mm. Overall, the thickness of the lid closed down is just about 40mm. So that's silly, and it kind of goes to the heart of this laptop. The numbers on the page are huge. It's how it comes together that doesn't work quite as well as I would have hoped. Also, the keyboard is by SteelSeries, Cherry MX per key RGB. On paper, absolutely brilliant. In use, no problems at all. But it didn't wow me, and that somewhat surprised me. Also, the pricing. This is a peculiar press sample we've got here, but I cannot find the GT77 on sale with this processor at the moment. So I'm going to speculate on the price. On past information, £4,000 very likely. Not for the spec I have here, but for the spec you're likely to buy with 32 gig of memory and either 1 or 2 terabytes of storage, not this 64 gig 4 terabyte beast that I have. So think £4,000 or thereabouts, and maybe even $5,000 US, although these days pounds, dollars much the same. It's expensive, but we're going to park talk of pricing. We're going to talk about instead the experience of the MSI Titan GT77. We open the MSI Center software, which controls the different power profiles and also HW info, and let's have a look at how the MSI profiles affect the PL1 and PL2 settings for the processor. In silent mode, the CPU runs at 30 watts, and I can tell you from my research that results in a clock speed of 1.6 gigahertz. In balanced mode, the settings say PL2, i.e. turbo 200 watts, and then PL1, the sustained power 100 watts. In actual fact, in practice, you're likely to see 140 watts boost, which is 3.9 gigahertz, and then a sustained 3.5 gigahertz at 100 watts. Extreme performance looks similar to balanced mode, 200 watts and 125 watts. In my testing, I saw a boost to 4.1 gigahertz at 175 watts, and then a sustained 3.8 gigahertz at 125 watts. And how does the cooling system cope during that Blender workload? Let's start with silent mode, which is indeed sub-ambient. Then in balanced mode, it starts to get noisy. And extreme performance mode, yup, it's running flat out and quite rackety. The thing is, while the cooling system certainly gets noisy, I don't want to make too big a deal about it, which is quite out of character for me. The fact is, every hefty laptop we've seen in recent times where the CPU can potentially draw hundreds of watts, and the same is true of the graphics, the cooling systems are just driven to the edge. In my opinion, laptops such as this Titan and the SteelSeries SE are for headphone users. Clearly Blender is a CPU workload, so let's try a combined workload, say Firestrike. And as soon as we click on 3D Mark, it immediately changes from balance mode to extreme performance mode. We have no say in the matter. And once TimeSpy stress test is running, you won't be the least bit surprised to see that the graphics are drawing most of the power, the CPU very little power, and the cooling does indeed get somewhat rorty. And let us touch on one final aspect of the MSI Center software. We have a fair amount of RGB in this laptop. It's in the keyboard and it's in the back of the chassis. And we also have an illuminated MSI logo in the lid. You might think that you control the software through MSI's Mystic Light software, which is part of MSI Center. But no, you'd be wrong. Instead, the RGB is controlled by SteelSeries and their own software, SteelSeries Engine. MSI Center software isn't the greatest. They continue to make improvements to it. It works. However, apps such as Mystic Light live in a different part of Center. You have to track it down. You actually have to install it before you can use it. And then having installed Mystic Light to control the RGB on your MSI product, which makes perfect sense, it then turns out you don't use Mystic Light on this product, you do on a motherboard, but not here. Instead, you have to go over to SteelSeries Engine. And I don't think that's the least bit intuitive. Let's take a tour of the ports and connectors. On the left side, we have the power jack, which looks similar to a USB Type A, but most definitely is not. Next to that, we have two USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A's, an SD Express card reader, and a 3.5mm combo audio jack. On the right side, we have 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, HDMI 2.1, a mini DisplayPort, two USB-Cs which are Thunderbolt 4 with DisplayPort 1.4, and a third USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A. It's time for the testing and performance charts, and you may spot one or two apparent anomalies in the charts that I'm about to show you. And that's because when I was showing you earlier on the clock speeds this laptop can run at in different power modes, the laptop here is nice and cool. It's mainly sitting idle, it's in silent mode, 30 watts. The ambient temperature here is about 19 Celsius. When I was testing a day or two ago, the ambient was 22, 23, and the laptop was being pounded, left to cool down, and again and again and again. And therefore it was warmer. And this made a significant difference. For example, in extreme performance mode, this laptop can run at 125 watts rather than 175, and that's a difference between 4.1 gigahertz and 3.8 gigahertz. And the same is also true in balanced mode. Instead of 100 watts, it might run at 70. In Cinebench R23 multi-core, the Titan is close to the top of the chart, pipped slightly by the Asus ROG Strix-Scar SE Turbo, which after all has basically the same processor. Stripping that chart down to just show the higher performing laptops, you can see there is a significant margin of difference between the Asus and the MSI. And the reason is power. The Asus was pulling 140 watts, the MSI in this test run 105 watts. Moving on to Cinebench R23 single core, we have a single test run, and that's because the MSI automatically switched into extreme performance mode, wouldn't run the other two modes. And we can see it performs perfectly okay. The curiosity is that the MSI was pulling 40 watts for the processor, where the Asus was using 35 watts, and yet the Asus was clearly running slightly faster. It makes you wonder whether this Core i9-12900HX processor is slightly inferior silicon to the i9-12950HX. Blender Classroom. Here we have 3 test runs. That MSI Center software is definitely peculiar. In extreme performance mode, it does well, but is beaten by the Asus. In balance mode, it does almost as well. In silent mode, it's close to the bottom of the charts, chugging along very slowly. Bapco Crossmark, a similar story. You can see that the MSI Titan figures are mixed in with the Asus ROG Strix-Scar SE. In 7-zip decompression, the MSI Titan does a decent job in the 2 powerful modes. Pull it down to silent mode and the performance crashes. In 7-zip compression we have a couple of curiosities. The best figure for the Titan is in balance mode, it does less well in extreme performance mode, and then in silent mode it's way down the bottom of the chart. 3D Mark Time Spy, just the CPU score, it does okay. In the 3D Mark Time Spy graphics score, it pips the Asus by the tiniest of margins. And when we strip down the figures to show just the big contenders, you can see that this is despite the fact the MSI is using slightly less power than the Asus ROG Strix Scar. And then we look at the overall score, combining obviously CPU and GPU, and we can see that the Titan does well, but the Asus does better. Gaming. We're running at 1080p here because the screen on this laptop is only 1080. As far as I can see, all the retail examples use 4K panels. Here we are restricted. And in Cyberpunk 2077, the Titan does perfectly well, but it is beaten quite soundly by the Asus. And it's a similar story in Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy at 1080, where the Asus beats the Titan by a significant margin. Far Cry 6 at 1080, we're getting used to this story. Once again, the Titan comes in second. In Watch Dogs Legion at 1080, this is a complete curiosity to me. The MSI Raider laptop is at the top of the charts, and then the Titan, and then the Asus. I've no idea what's going on here, but those are the results. And finally we have the battery test, and the MSI Titan does very nicely. If we take the ROG Zephyrus G14, which is AMD powered and highly efficient, out of the equation, we can see that out of the big powerful gaming laptops, the Titan is actually doing incredibly well. In conclusion, what do I think of the MSI Titan GT77? Pros, the good parts. The CPU-GPU combination gives you mighty performance. This of course comes as no surprise, but our figures confirm it. You have a good selection of ports and connectors, and they're easy to reach on the sides of the laptop as well. The storage and the RAM are easy to upgrade. Pull off that bottom cover, there you go. Cons, the negative points. Seems to me the Cooler Boost Titan cooling system struggles with the CPU and GPU combination. There's a lot of power going through that hardware. As we saw with our recent Asus review, their vapor chamber cooler and conductor naught liquid metal made a big difference both to cooling and to performance. Both the laptop and the power adapter are large and heavy. That power brick is just enormous. The MSI Center software is clunky and not particularly helpful. This is an ongoing theme with all sorts of third-party software. It really struck home here with the fact that functions are even split between the MSI Center software and SteelSeries engine. Not great. And finally, on this particular example, the 1080p display makes little sense on a laptop of this size. That might be specific to this one sample we've been sent by Intel. However, we have seen 1080p displays on MSI's 17.3 chassis any number of times. It seems to be a theme, and I don't much like it. Overall, I'm giving it a worth considering and a 7 out of 10.